The story begins by introducing us to a family. A 48-year-old woman named Annie, her husband Peter, and their two daughters all lived together. Annie was not Peter's first wife, but his second. His first wife had taken a divorce from Peter and was living separately with their son Gustav. At this point, Gustav was around 19 to 20 years old. Even though Peter had separated from his first wife and son, he still loved Gustav deeply and wanted to keep him during the summer holidays so he could spend some quality time with him. So Peter talks to Annie and asks her permission to bring Gustav into their home. But Annie was not comfortable with the idea of having Gustav around, so she initially refuses Peter. However, to keep Peter happy, she eventually agrees. When Peter's two daughters hear that Gustav is coming, they get really excited. Peter himself goes to pick up Gustav and brings him home the very next morning. The moment Annie sees Gustav, she cannot take her eyes off him because he was quite handsome and young. In front of Peter, she gives Gustav a warm welcome and the whole family sits down together for breakfast. During breakfast, Annie's two daughters say hello to Gustav and gift him a keychain and a painting that they had lovingly made themselves. But Gustav does not really open up to them and just sits there quietly. The next day, Annie goes to visit her sister and tells her about the situation at home. She explains that Peter's first wife wants to send Gustav to a boarding school, but since it is summer holidays right now, Peter wants him to stay with them. Annie was not happy about this at all. After venting to her sister, when Annie returns home, she finds that very same keychain lying outside, the one her daughter had gifted to Gustav. Seeing this, Annie feels quite bad. She picks up the keychain, keeps it with her, and goes inside. She then starts cleaning Gustav's room. Just then Gustav also walks in, wearing only a towel, and Annie finds herself unable to look away. She tries to make conversation with him, but Gustav does not pay much attention to her since he was not comfortable around Annie yet. The next morning, when Annie returns from her morning walk, she hears Peter and Gustav shouting at each other. She quickly realizes that Gustav does not want to stay here and is arguing with Peter about it. Peter, on the other hand, was insisting that Gustav stay with them. In frustration, Gustav storms out of the house. That night, Annie tries to calm Peter down and tells him, he is living with you for the first time, so it will take him a little time to adjust. After that, Annie tries to get close to Peter for some quality time together, but Peter shows very little interest. Seeing this, Annie feels a little disheartened and quietly goes off to sleep without saying a word. This is where we realize that Annie and Peter's relationship is lacking in romance and intimacy, and there is a deep emotional distance between the two of them. The next day, when Annie comes back home from the office, she notices the house is a little messy, which strikes her as odd. She goes to check her room and finds that her purse is missing. Annie immediately thinks the house has been robbed and calls the police to report the incident. She cannot figure out how or who broke in. Just then she spots Gustav entering the house and asks him to check his room to see if anything is missing. Sometime after this incident, while Annie is doing the laundry, she finds the keychain inside Gustav's pants pocket. The very same keychain she had picked up from outside and kept with herself. Seeing this, Annie puts two and two together and realizes Gustav must have been the one who robbed the house. So Annie returns the keychain to Gustav and says, I had picked this up from outside and put it in my purse, but I forgot to give it to you, and then my purse got stolen. So how did it end up with you? Hearing this, Gustav is completely caught off guard. Annie then gives him an ultimatum, saying either he comes clean to Peter himself or he starts living with them like a proper family member and joins them on outings to get to know everyone better. Even though Gustav had no desire to spend time with these people, he had no choice but to go along with Annie and the kids. Seeing Gustav laugh and smile with the daughters, Annie also feels genuinely happy, and slowly she starts feeling drawn toward Gustav. That night, Gustav brings his girlfriend home and introduces her to Annie. He then takes his girlfriend to his room to spend some private time with her. The sounds from inside the room were clearly audible to Annie sitting outside, and it starts to distract her. She goes to her room and begins looking at herself in the mirror in a very romantic way, as if she were asking herself whether she was still attractive. The next night, when Annie comes home from work, Peter shows a little concern for her being late, but Annie tells him work was heavier than usual. Soon after, Annie moves closer to Peter and the two share some intimate moments together. The next day, the whole family heads out to a river to go swimming. But instead of joining in, Annie stays busy with some work. Gustav notices this and does not feel good about it. So he walks over to Annie and tells her to come swim with them. But Annie declines. Gustav walks away looking a little disappointed. However, Annie cannot stand seeing Gustav upset because somewhere deep down she had started to like him. So Annie pushes herself and joins them at the river anyway. The whole family has a wonderful time together, and Gustav really opens up and bonds well with both daughters. That night back at the house, Annie and Gustav sit together having drinks and talking for a long time. During their conversation, Annie notices the tattoos on Gustav's hands and is really drawn to them. Gustav tells her he made them himself. Annie is thoroughly impressed, and, wanting to build a stronger bond with him, she asks Gustav to give her a tattoo on her hand as well. This brings the two of them much closer. The next day, Peter sets up a business meeting at home, with his colleagues and partners attending. But Annie gets completely bored sitting through their meeting. So she steps out to the lawn and sits alone with a drink. She had barely started drinking when Gustav walks out and says, "I am heading out for a smoke. Want to come along?" Annie agrees, and without a second thought, she leaves the guests behind and heads to a bar with Gustav. During their time together, Annie feels so drawn to Gustav that without even thinking, she leans in and kisses him. Gustav is caught off guard, but does not stop her and does not get angry either. It was as if he too was feeling attracted to Annie. A little while later, Gustav quietly leaves. When Annie comes back home, Peter is furious with her for walking out on their guests without saying a word. Annie says nothing in return, and Peter storms off to his room in anger. The next day, while Peter is out in the garden playing with his daughters, Gustav comes and sits close to Annie and touches her hand. Annie feels herself being pulled toward him once again. But then Gustav gets up and goes to play with everyone else, while Annie watches him from a distance with longing eyes because she had fallen for him. She spends the entire day thinking only about him, and even at night she cannot sleep because Gustav had completely taken over her mind. She wanted to take this feeling further. So Annie finally gathers her courage and walks into Gustav's room late at night. Seeing Annie walk in at that hour, Gustav says nothing. Annie sits beside him and begins touching him. Gustav does not stop her either, and instead feels very comfortable with her. And so the two of them become intimate right there. The very next day, Annie goes out and buys Gustav a nice laptop. When Peter finds out that Annie is being so thoughtful and caring toward Gustav, and even brought him a laptop, he is genuinely touched and happy about it. One night, Annie notices that Gustav is sitting with her daughters on his own, telling them a bedtime story. She finds this incredibly endearing. By now their relationship has gone so far that Annie and Gustav are secretly carrying on a physical affair. But one day while the two of them are spending time together in the bathroom, Peter comes home early from the office. Not seeing Annie around, he asks his daughters where she is. The daughters say she probably stepped out. Hearing Peter's voice, both Annie and Gustav freeze in panic. Annie quickly slips out of the bathroom, leaving Gustav behind, and nervously makes her way toward the kitchen where Peter is. She asks him why he came home early. Peter tells her, "I just could not focus on work today, so I came back." This makes Annie incredibly anxious about the possibility of Peter finding out the truth about her and Gustav. But even after feeling that fear, Annie does not pull away from Gustav, because she was getting the kind of love and attention from him that Peter had never given her. So she starts spending even more time with Gustav. The two of them go on walks in the woods and share precious private moments together. During one of these moments, Gustav pulls out a tape recorder and starts asking Annie personal questions. Annie opens up and shares that the worst moment of her life was losing her father. She also shares that her sister is her closest friend and the one she goes to with all her problems. Gustav then asks her about relationships she had before her marriage and records all of her personal confessions on the tape recorder. Sometime later, the whole family comes together to celebrate the daughter's birthday. As Annie steps away to handle something in the garden, Gustav seizes the moment and follows her there, pulling her in for a kiss. But Annie stops him and tells him to back off because anyone could walk in on them. And sure enough, Annie's sister arrives and catches the two of them together. She is furious and walks away. Annie follows her trying to explain, but her sister refuses to listen. Now Annie is terrified that her sister might tell Peter everything about her and Gustav. The fear is so overwhelming that she cannot even enjoy the party and tells Gustav to keep his distance. After that, Gustav climbs up a large tree and everyone tells him to come down. But he does not listen to anyone. His behavior makes Annie even more anxious. Then Gustav jumps down from the tree without warning and lies still on the ground. Annie and Peter are horrified and are about to call an ambulance when Gustav suddenly bursts out laughing. It was all just a prank. Peter is furious at his son for this stunt and walks away in anger. The next day, Annie takes Gustav into the woods and tells him, "This relationship was always going to end someday, and that time has come now. So let us end things here and move on." She also makes it very clear that neither of them will ever mention any of this to Peter. Gustav reluctantly agrees. The following morning, when Annie returns from her morning walk, Peter tells her, I want to strengthen my bond with Gustav. So the two of us are going away together for a few days. Annie gives him her blessing to go. She then heads over to her sister's place to try and make things right between them, since her sister had not been answering her calls or meeting with her. Annie explains to her, "It is over between me and Gustav now." But her sister refuses to forgive her, and Annie leaves with a heavy heart. A few days later, Peter and Gustav return home. That night, Peter tells Annie, Gustav has decided to go to boarding school. And then he adds, "He also told me everything. The truth about what happened between the two of you." Hearing this, the ground shifts beneath Annie's feet. She had asked Gustav to keep this a secret, and he had gone ahead and told Peter everything. But even now, Annie does not panic. Instead, to protect herself and pin the blame on Gustav, she tells Peter, "Gustav is lying. He wants you to divorce me and get back together with his mother." She also says, "Gustav has never liked me from the very beginning. That is why he is now making up these stories to get me in trouble." Peter is left unsure. He wonders whether Gustav is really lying or whether Annie is trying to cover up the truth. Seeing Peter's suspicious expression, Annie gets upset and threatens to leave the house. She also drops the bombshell that Gustav was the one behind the robbery at their home. After hearing this, Peter sides with Annie. He starts to believe Gustav acted out of bitterness because he disliked Annie. Seeing Annie as the victim, Peter pulls her into a hug, and Annie successfully manages to trap Peter in her web of lies, while completely destroying Gustav's image in his father's eyes. The truth was that Gustav had told Peter about the affair because he did not want to lose Annie. He had become deeply attached to her. But in the end, he had to bow down to Annie's wishes, and she pushed him away. That rejection cut Gustav like a knife. The next day, Annie goes into Gustav's room and destroys the tape recorder so that Gustav is left with no evidence against her. After this, Peter confronts Gustav in front of Annie and scolds him for lying. Gustav tries his best to convince Peter that he was telling the truth and that the affair was very real. But Peter refuses to listen to a single word. This makes Gustav absolutely furious. To look good in front of Peter, Annie even tries to get Gustav to admit he was lying and just let it go. But Gustav spits in her face and walks out. Annie is enraged and tells Peter she will not allow Gustav to stay in this house any longer. Seeing his son's behavior, Peter feels deeply ashamed and begins making arrangements to send Gustav to boarding school the very next day. Watching Gustav leave, both of Peter's daughters are heartbroken because they had grown very close to him. But Peter takes Gustav and sets off toward the boarding school. Sometime later, when Annie arrives at her office, she is shocked to find Gustav sitting there. She quickly pulls him into her cabin and asks him why he came. Gustav threatens her and says, "If you do not tell Peter the whole truth yourself, I will file a case against you for misconduct." But Annie does not flinch. She fires back, "Do you really think anyone is going to believe your story? Because you have absolutely no evidence against me." Hearing this, Gustav goes quiet. Annie then offers him a deal and says, "Go to Peter and admit that everything you said was a lie. If you do that, we will put all of this behind us and start living as a family again." Gustav says nothing and walks away. Time passes, and Annie happily celebrates Christmas with her family. But in the middle of the night, when everyone is asleep, Gustav shows up outside the house making a scene because he wants to tell Peter the truth once and for all. Annie rushes out and tries to calm him down. She blocks him from going inside and says, "Peter will never take your side, and there is no place for you in this house. It is better that you just go." Hearing all of this, Gustav completely breaks down right there in the middle of the street and starts crying. But Annie shows him no mercy. She leaves him there on the street and goes back inside. Sometime later, Annie throws a party at their home, and her sister comes too. Annie tries once more to patch things up with her, and this time the two sisters finally start talking again. But amidst all this happiness, Peter seems very stressed. When Annie asks what is wrong, Peter tells her that since Christmas, Gustav has not gone back to school, and he is not with his mother either. Nobody has seen or heard from him since that night. Hearing this, Annie feels deeply unsettled because the last time anyone saw Gustav, he had come to see her. The very next day, because of Gustav's disappearance, Peter decides to go visit his first wife since she had already filed a missing persons report with the police. The mention of the police makes Annie even more anxious. When Peter returns home that night, he looks completely devastated. Annie asks him, "What happened?" Peter tells her, "The police have found Gustav's body." Annie is stunned and overwhelmed with grief because she never imagined that Gustav would take his own life or that her lies would cost someone their life. The truth was that Gustav had ended his life because Annie's lies had completely destroyed him in his father's eyes. He had lost his father's trust and love, and Annie had betrayed him as well. Losing his son shatters Peter completely. When Annie tries to comfort him, He grabs her face and silences her because Peter felt deep down that if he had not listened to Annie and pushed Gustav away, his son would still be alive today. The next day, the whole family gets dressed and prepares to leave for Gustav's funeral. And with that, the movie comes to an end. So friends, what did you think of this movie? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell icon so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next one. Till then, bye-bye, take care.